We're going to turn to our next presentation, which is entitled Mastery-Based Education with a Culturally Responsive Imagination, Remarks on Early Research. And let's welcome Lindsey Foster, Pamela D'Andrea Martinez, and Leah Peoples from New York University, and Joy Nolan and Meg Stentz from the Mastery Collaborative.
No.
Hello, thank you so much for having us. We're so excited to be here. And we're going to go ahead and kick things off with Joy and Meg giving us the introduction.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Let's jump to the second slide. Can you hear me? Fantastic. Thank you so very much. I'm going to try to be short and sweet to make up for a little bit of lost time. Just very appreciative to be in this space with everyone and hearing a lot of the kinds of work that make me feel like I'm in a space where people are speaking the same language that we're always talking about. So we are Mastery Collaborative. We are part of New York City Public Schools. We work with 70 schools around the city as member schools. So that means we give them individual coaching and support. We also have a much wider group called the Friends of Mastery Collaborative, which has hundreds and hundreds of people from different schools around New York City, other states, and even other countries. We, as a community, focus on mastery-based learning, or some folks might know it as competency-based learning, and culturally responsive and sustaining systems and practices. So we're basically combining competency with culturally responsive practices. And we started out really with a focus on mastery and youth-centered learning, and then quickly realized that in New York City, in order to actually be youth-centered, we needed cultural competency and all the other aspects of CRE, culturally responsive education. So that is what we're up to as a community. Next slide, please. So folks think of competency ed as an academic set of strategies and practices. The Mastery Collaborative really works with schools on curriculum, moves in the classroom, and all interactions between young people with young people, amongst the staff and adults in the building. We also look at grading practices, which is what leads schools to us a lot of the time, but is sort of to us, starting with grading practices is like, you know, the tail wagging the dog to some degree. So we end up getting into these other aspects too. And it's sort of most fundamentally a learner-centered and responsive culture within the school. Next slide, please. So what looks different in a Mastery Collaborative school? There's obviously, like in many competency-based schools, there is a real value placed on young people doing the work themselves, like prioritizing the messy, wonderful learning process over the perfect artifact that is more structured and possibly more scaffolded. Grades are functioning ideally as feedback. There's a whole side conversation we don't have time for about grades as credentials. There's a lot of equity issues around grading, especially during the pandemic. But ideally within the classroom, grades are functioning as a message to young people about where they are in their learning in relation to what the learning targets are. And then there is a mastery retake system. So instead of extra credit, young people can improve in each class by actually increasing their mastery and showing the evidence of that. Next slide, please. Thanks, Natalie. I just realized it was you that's driving the slides. Much appreciation. So I don't want to spend time on this. Folks that have been in the competency ed universe will be seeing some familiarity here with the 5 shifts that Ina Cole put out, now called Aurora, made famous across the United States. We took those 5 shifts of mastery learning, which have now grown and evolved on the Aurora side. But we keep these 5 things and have included them with our framework for mastery and culturally responsive implementation. And hopefully Meg can share the link to that bit.ly in a slide deck so you can look at it another time. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what we've done possibly in an unusual or unique way is to bring culturally responsive practices into our schools, and we're really learning from and with them. So the elements of culturally responsive practices, the pillars, came from Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is the founder of, the first person to advance this theory of culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRE, culturally relevant education. Students must experience academic success. That can look all kinds of ways. We think that competency ed, or mastery-based learning, fits really well into that pillar, among others, but really helps with that. And then students must develop or maintain cultural competence, which is the ability to know one's own identity and perspectives, understand how you show up in a room, and be able to interact successfully with others based not on similarity to them, however you're thinking about similarities and differences. So we're talking effective collaborations across age, race, sexual preference and identity, things like that. You know who you are and you're comfortable interacting with others effectively, whether or not they are like you. And then the idea of critical consciousness, through which young people develop a way of sort of analyzing and critiquing the world around them, and a sense of agency to make changes, band together with others, and make meaningful changes. Next slide, please. CRE, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings originally called this work culturally relevant pedagogy, or culturally relevant education. It's been known for the last 20 years or so as CRE. It has recently evolved in the field into the term CRSE, which is culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. So if you're interested in tracing this path, I suggest you grab the slide deck, and we have some books and other things in here to help you increase your knowledge. So next slide, please, without dwelling here. New York State has a really beautiful framework for CRSE. You can look at it. They have indicators for students, school leaders, policymakers, and everyone, different stakeholders, families. And we think this book describes a world that we have yet to see, that we would like to see. And I know that folks at NYU, our researchers, were deeply involved in the collaborative creation of this resource, which we love and our community uses. So big thank you to them. And next. Thank you. So here are some benefits to learners that we have begun to see. Young people talk about it this way. Transparency, power shifts and role shifts. We really do interrogate power and how power is used, how power is shared. You'll notice that we don't use the word empower. We learned that actually from the NYU researchers. Empowering is sort of like including, where basically like you have power and you're letting other people have it. People have power, people have voices, people belong places, and we're not the arbiters of that. So we talk about power shifts and role shifts, consciously creating space where power is not the traditional teacher tells the student what to do and they comply in order to get a grade. We have noticed positive learning identity when kids are no longer thinking, I'm bad at math, I'm a C student kind of thing. And then obviously mastery of key skills, which originally we did not add this here because to us this was straight up mastery. But Zaretta Hammond said like, no, that needs to be there because the academic success piece is super important. So that was her plug to us. And so that is one of the benefits that we have added here. And I think that is our last slide. Next, please. Yeah, let's skip this one in the interest of time and handing it off to our researchers at NYU Metro Center, Leah.
Yes, so hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting us. It's good to be in great company with all of our partners, Mastery Collaborative, who just presented, also KnowledgeWorks, who makes this project even possible, and the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative. My name is Dr. Leah Peoples, and I work at NYU Metro Center, and I'm the study lead for the Culturally Responsive Mastery-Based Education Research Study. And a little bit of background about me is that I mostly use critical race theories when I'm looking at research, and I'm heavily invested in understanding equity and liberation across school systems. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'm just gonna pass it off to my colleagues to briefly introduce themselves as well.
Hey everybody, I'm Pamela D'Andrea Martinez, also a researcher at NYU Metro Center. In a graduate researcher capacity, I'm getting my PhD in urban education, and I focus on culturally and linguistically responsive education for immigrant youth. Very happy to be here, just as grateful as everybody who has unmuted so far.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsey Foster. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm also a researcher at the NYU Metro Center, working on the culturally responsive mastery-based education project with both Leah and Pamela, along with Joy and Meg. I'm very excited to be here. My personal research interests center on the experience or the educational experience of young Black girls, particularly around discipline. Very excited to share some insights from our study and to continue to learn with folks. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So really quickly about our center. So we all are at Policy Research and Evaluation. We partnered up with Mastery Collaborative. All of our work focuses on making research and evaluation and education action-oriented, so that's important, liberating, accessible, and results in more equitable systems, policies, and practices. So that's really key to know as you enter our session, if you decide to join us, is that a lot of our framing and our work seeks to increase those things. Next slide, please. So really quickly about the study, there are three main goals of the study. One was to learn about how CRE and MBE, or how culture responsive education and mastery-based education come together, how practitioners are bringing both of these approaches to teaching and learning and schooling together, one, school-wide. So what does it look like when you see it in the policies? What does it look like when you see it in the systems, the structure? How do we actually operationalize culture responsive education within an existing mastery-based education system? Two, we also really wanted to understand how teachers' attitudes and their practices also reflected this combination of both CRE and MBE. And then finally, we also looked at student outcomes as well in terms of how students were also integrated into these systems. So those are our three main goals. We interviewed teachers, we interviewed students, we also did surveys as well, a couple of observations, and then we also collected documents that would indicate CRE and MBE practices. Next slide, please. There are three key findings that we're going to briefly touch on today, right now. One is that when it comes to school-wide practices and policies, there weren't full models that we were able to discover. So there's a lot of extensive MBE models that exist, but most of where we see CRE happening systemically is actually in the advisory system. And so that was a really interesting find. There's so many nuances on what makes something institutional and practices taught across the entire school. And we can't wait to share more of that in upcoming publications and webinars and things of that nature. The second key finding we're going to actually talk about in our session in our breakout rooms, and it's about teachers' attitudes and practices. One of the most essential findings of all of our research was so much of our data depended on how much culture responsive education imagination that teachers, admin, and staff had to see. Does CRE fit in practices? Does CRE fit in just grading policies? Is CRE just discipline? Is it just curriculum, et cetera? And so we talk a little bit about that, and we're excited to share that. And then finally, we also learned about student perspectives. And by and large, students reported like higher senses of motivation, of senses of belonging, and senses of social consciousness. And I'll just say social political consciousness. I'll just say that we ended up working with about 25 students in those surveys. And so it wasn't a huge sample, but there were some really interesting findings that came out of that. But again, we won't be talking about that today. So please join us in our breakout room if you're interested in a really cool dialogue between practitioners and researchers about how this work manifested both in the research, but then also in the practice side. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Leah and Joy and your whole teams. The Mastery Collaborative is doing such amazing work in New York City, and really looking forward to hearing from you in the breakout rooms. And I know the Mastery Collaborative teachers and school administrators are also going to be speaking at our symposium next week. So more opportunities to hear about the terrific work that you're all doing.